This is Conversations with Ronnie Keith. Thank you so much for joining Conversations with Ronnie Keith. I am your host, Ronnie Keith. I want to take the time out to thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. It has been an honor and a pleasure sitting here to do this show every week with my wife and also with the special guests that we have on this week. I will have a special guest on. We'll get to our special guest here in a few moments. Just want to take the time out to just thank you all. We've done very well. A lot of you are listening. Some of you are downloading, and I understand, it's a lot to download, but, every little bit counts. If you want to support us by downloading, that'll be great. Hitting that download, that arrow button that goes down. Send us a fan mail. That'll be great. When you open up the podcast and there's a little link there, you'll see it highlighted. It'll say send Keith a text message. Just click that, and it's just like a text message. And I don't see who you are unless you put your name. I'll just know the city and name of the city and state that you're sending a message to. But we just want to take the time out. I want to take the time out to thank you. Over 11 countries, 67 different cities have downloaded the Conversations with Ronnie Keith podcast. And I just want to take that time out to say thank you. Really appreciate it. Really thankful and grateful for all of the support. We actually have a fan mail we want to get to this week. There's a few other fan mails that we still have to get to, but of course, we will answer that next week when my son is on for the first half, as there's some questions for him, and my wife Iris is on for the second half, as we has to follow up on some questions that were asked of us. Between this episode and that episode, if you guys want to send in anything for me, for my son, for Iris, or any of my previous guests, please send it in. We're really thankful. I'm really grateful for you guys supporting. We have a fan mail today from Atlanta, Georgia. And it says, great episode. As always, Antoine gave so many gems and laughter. I am loving his TikTok clips as well. These interviews are a breath of fresh air, definitely more intimate and informative than most we see on social media. Keep up the great work. Steph, thank you so much, Steph. I really appreciate you listening, supporting. Thank you so much for sending in that fan mail. Very, very appreciative of that. Again, guys, I just can't thank you all enough for all of the support. As I said earlier, we have a very special guest here today that I'm going to get into here. But I do want you guys to please take the time to send in fan mails, continue to listen, download, support. Next week, like I said, we'll go through some more of these fan mail questions with my wife and my son. So thank you so much. Again, listeners, this is a very, very, very special show that we have for you today. Today I brought on a special gentleman. He is a former police officer in the state of, Anchorage, Alaska Police Department. He started there in 1996 and retired in 2021. He's now an author. He specialized in crime scene analysis, deviant sexual crimes, hostage negotiations, and various special assignments. He has a book out. It's on Amazon. It is called 50 Shades of True Crime. And I love the name of that book because my wife is a big fan of 50 Shades of Grey, and she's a big fan of crime. And so that all mixes well together. And this is an excellent book. I want to welcome to the show Doug Fifer. Doug, thank you so much for coming on Conversations with Ronnie Keith. How are you today?
I'm fantastic, Ronnie, and thank you so much for having me.
Oh, my pleasure, my pleasure. I really, really do appreciate it. So, Doug, you know, we're going to jump into everything about you. I want to give listeners, that was just a little intro for my listeners, but I really would like for you to dive into your background of being a police officer for 25 years, an Alaskan police officer at that. And, the things that you've run across and things that you've seen in all of your years working as a police officer and working the cases that you've worked, because these are not your typical, hey, your speeding cases that you have. These are really high touch, high crime cases that you worked on. So if you don't mind, just give my audience a little background on who you are.
Yeah, I would love to. So I was born in Homer, Alaska, which is a small town of about 260 miles south of Anchorage, 5,000 residents, so very small. I grew up mainly in the Anchorage area, went to school there. And in 96, I needed a job like most young people do. I
Mhm.
thought the police department would be an incredible place to learn new things. It would constantly be changing, would be kind of an adrenaline high for working it. And so I applied with the Anchorage Police Department in 96, like I said, and also the Alaska State Troopers.
Oh, wow.
APD hired me first, and then the troopers offered me a job a week later, but I'd already accepted one. So I did my career right in Anchorage, which was 25 years, as you'd mentioned. Alaska is very unique. It's the largest state in the Union, of course. If you
Mhm.
put it on the continental United States, it's about a third of America. It's massive.
Mhm.
So that brings in a unique twist on law enforcement on how we investigate cases such as homicides, sexual assaults, robberies, because you have such vast territory. How do officers cover all of that? So the two main departments are APD and the Alaska State Troopers, which both have had TV shows up north at various times. Uh,
Mhm.
I was a uniformed investigator. 25 years, you pretty much do it all. So
Right.
I had units that I worked in for 4 or 5 years, and I would go try something new, like a hostage negotiator, crime scene response team, those type of investigations. So I love to switch around because it kind of cross trained you as a cop, and
Mhm.
also it made it exciting because things were always changing in your career. The way the book came about is I always wanted to write true crime post law enforcement. They really don't let you do it while you're working. Makes sense.
Right. Right.
The live
Right.
cases, especially a book like this. But what I wanted to do is come out a little differently on the flavor of true crime. There's a million true crime books out there, a
Mhm.
lot of them written by retired cops, FBI agents, things like that. There's really no book that crosses, like you said, the 50 Shades of Gray with law enforcement. So 50 Shades of True Crime does cross both of them. It takes the most sexually deviant crimes ever committed and puts it into a true crime book. So it's not your typical serial killer or robbery or investigation. It's really unique on that deviant side of human psyche, which I dealt with for most of my career. So I take the most darkest cases, put them together, and that's what the reader gets.
Absolutely. I appreciate that. Yeah, because your book starts out with a bang. Okay. Cucumbers, cough drops, pizza or pigs.
Yeah.
When you use that, I said, oh, wow, this is going to be a very different book. So, and it's funny that you stated how big Alaska was, right? Because, being in school all those years, you think of the different states that are big. And my wife and I, we just came back from California. And so the first thing I said, yeah, I think California is the biggest state. She was like, no, maybe it's Texas. I said, no, I think it's California. And
Yeah.
sure enough, as we're driving from Palm Springs to Los Angeles, she goes and pulls it up and she's like, no, it's actually Alaska. And I said, oh, okay. So, it's very interesting to hear because a lot of times being, Alaska is part of the United States, but sometimes we feel that it may be a little bit disconnected. And so when we hear about these different things that happen in Alaska, you don't really hear about, horrid high crimes like this. And so when you signed up for the police department, and as you said, you guys get cross trained. Was that an interest of yours when you first signed up to be a police officer?
I think it was. Being born in Alaska, living in a community, I think working for your local police department, you get to interact with everyone all the time. You're really involved in everything, which I enjoy. I mean, I'm a super friendly person. I like to talk. I like to interact with people. So I think being a cop was just natural, like second nature to me. The uniqueness of Alaska. I mean, I love the state. If you've never visited, and for your listeners, please get to Alaska. It is the most beautiful place on planet Earth. I know I'm a little biased, but you've got to see it at least once in your lifetime. Lots of other beautiful places, but I always call that home, and I've never seen anything better. Uh, as far as its size, it's quite unique. Anchorage is the largest city by landmass. So not only are we the
Oh,
largest
wow.
state, but Anchorage by landmass is the largest territory for a police department to cover. So typically in your large cities, you'll have two cops per vehicle that patrol and
Mhm.
handle crimes. In Alaska, you have one officer per vehicle just because the landmass is so large that
Wow.
You have to have multiple officers and cars to be able to reach, the vast area. So it's a little different than a large city. Anchorage is about 320,000, so it's not small by any means, but we have a special flavor of crime in Alaska. And while you may not hear about the crime up there, it's rampant. And one example is per capita, we have the most serial killers in the nation. That's due to population size. We have about 700,000 residents. So per capita, since we have a smaller population, we have more serial killers than anywhere else. So, so it's one of the most beautiful places on earth, but I remind people it's also one of the most dangerous places on earth. Yeah.
So, Doug, let me ask you a question here. With everything that you've seen there in Anchorage and how big of a mass it is, how often were you getting called for crimes that were happening in your city?
Well, if you worked on patrol for a shift, a 10 to 12 hour shift, you were call to call to call. So very rarely is there a break for a patrol officer on duty. They're literally jumping to the next call, solving it, arresting people, and moving on. If you work on specialty units, I call them call out units, such as the scene response team. That's a unit where we're the first on scene to evaluate if it's a suicide, a homicide, an accidental death. We're the investigators that map it out forensically to see if something's not on the up and up, kind of the first line of defense on homicide. That team was extremely busy because we'd have to go out to all different types of crimes to establish if it was or wasn't. So you may be called out 3 or 4 times a week in that. As a hostage negotiator, same thing. It's not just an active hostage negotiation with somebody that's taken a hostage. It might be a suicidal subject. It might be a subject that has mental issues or believes in something that's not happening, that you have to actively talk with them to quell the threat. So that team, I worked for the better part of 15 years. One of my most favorite, because it's always interesting, and you kind of get in a chess match with that individual. So it's
Mhm.
gamesmanship to get them out safely without resorting to violence. It saves the police officers and it also saves the citizens, which I like. So that was my favorite duty, is being a hostage negotiator.
So, you know, you, the most you see or hear about hostage negotiators are mostly on TVs, right? A lot of times when when I say TV, I mean movies. A lot of times when you hear about, these cases that happen or people are being held hostage or there's a standoff, most times with, what the news will portray is basically the police officers out there with guns. So as a hostage negotiator, did you ever have a instance where you had to just be right there in the front line, with nothing on as far as any type of guns or anything and negotiate with the hostage? Or is that done through the phone? Like, how did that work for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Extremely rare that I would be one on one. Remember, law enforcement officers are literally going to have a firearm or weapon or protection on them 24/7. We wear bulletproof vests that we wear, whether it's in a soft uniform, and by that I mean where it's not like a police uniform, it might be a suit, polo shirt, something like that. We're always going to have protection on. As a negotiator, we had all the bells and whistles. We had negotiator buses that were fully decked out with computers, audio, throw phones. A throw phone is something that if the person's cell phone gets cut off or they don't have a home phone, we'll have our SWAT team implement a phone into that residence with a wire, and then only the negotiators can contact that suspect at the time. So we use technology to our benefit. It keeps us safe and it keeps the suspect safe to work them out, over several hours of conversations. In fact, sometimes we will have negotiations that can last days.
Okay. So, wow. So with that, what is the craziest case that you've had to negotiate with? Like, who was the most craziest criminal? You don't have to give names, of course, but what was that case like for you negotiating, and what was the ending for that?
I think the most interesting case for me, we had a serial killer, and I'll name him because it's public information. His name was Joshua Wade, and I reference him to being about as close to the devil as you can be.
Oh,
Had no empathy, so pure sociopath, could literally kill and then eat a hamburger 5 minutes later and not even blink an eye.
wow,
So
wow.
different than how normal people think. Obviously, he had committed a homicide in Anchorage. We had arrested him as the police department. went to a jury trial. The jury, and you never know what juries will do, they acquitted the serial killer of that homicide.
What?
Obviously, as a police officer, I was highly disappointed,
Right.
but you never know what's going to happen in a jury. We knew that he would kill again. Serial killers aren't one-offs. They once they kill, they keep killing. You can't stop them.
Right.
Uh, but we don't have the resources to track those individuals 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He served on some other minor violations related to the homicide, but not the homicide for a few years. Got out on probation. He ended up killing relatively quickly after that. The reason why we got onto him is because the victim lived right next door to where he was renting a room. So we quickly put two to two together, tracked him. He knew we were tracking him, so he fled. And we had a large manhunt in Alaska for about 4 or 5 days. Incredibly, he was able to evade us for a long time. Some patrol units were able to find him in Anchorage, and a chase ensued. He ended up breaking into an apartment and taking 2 hostages. That's
Oh,
where I got the call. So I responded to the location. He had a cell phone. I called in, and we started negotiating. I was able to have him release the first victim. Subsequently, well into it, I was able to get him to release the second victim. We then took Joshua Wade into custody. I also assisted in the interrogation of him. Brutal, brutal individual. He was sentenced to 135 years. But that was one of the most unique interrogations and hostage negotiations I've ever had. He was highly intelligent,
mm,
had no emotions. Typically, negotiators play off emotion. We work your emotions against you. When you don't have them, it makes it very difficult for me to play off those and to get you where I need you to be and to come out safely. So it took longer than expected. And again, his intellect was very high, which
mhm.
shocked me. So it was that chess match was grueling on my part. Eventually, we were able to get him out and sentenced, and he was sentenced to over 100 years in prison.
So, wow. So let me ask you this: Are most serial killers are not intelligent? Because I seen, I've watched. I can't think of the name of the show. It was on Netflix. Mine Hunters, I believe that was the name of it. And they showcased a few of these serial killers that seem to have kind of a higher IQ. Is that a rare case in the real world? Well, that's real. It's based on reality. But in your world, was that a rare case to come across a serial killer with a high IQ?
No, I think it's not rare. It's actually the norm. I think
Oh,
in my experience, they've had a higher intellect than I expected. We had another one named Israel Keys that had an extremely high intellect as well. So in my experience, they tended to be smarter, which is odd. But the ones in Alaska, I mean, it's incredible. They carry on jobs. They're very smart. They're productive in their home lives. They just certainly have a brain dysfunction where they commit
right.
these heinous crimes, but not dumb by any means.
What are they asking for in those two instances? Well, the main instance, what was he asking for? What did he want? As I know it was a negotiation to get the hostages out of danger, but what was he asking in return?
Yep. So they always have demands. You mentioned movies. You'll see the helicopter, the food, things like that. We actually deal with all of that. And how I answer that, if you want a helicopter, I would say, Ronnie, that's not realistic.
Right.
That's TV stuff. We're not going to bring in a helicopter and fly you out. Quick, and quickly you'll come to that realization. So we don't overpromise. We're very honest as negotiators. Joshua Way, when I negotiated with him, he had some odd requests. One is normal. He did not want to be hurt coming out. That's a common one.
Mhm.
He had committed several homicides, so he figured that maybe the police would shoot him. So I had to walk him back on that because we'd never done that before. When we took him in custody prior, he'd never had an incident. So I walked him through that. The second thing is he wanted, as unique and odd as it sounds, he wanted to smoke some weed. Uh,
Mhm.
when you have hostages and it's life threatening, I don't have any issue with you smoking weed. Typically, cops aren't going to allow you to sit there and smoke a bowl or get into other drugs. In this case, I made the call that let him smoke his weed. We have time, and if he stays calm, that's best for everybody, and nobody gets hurt. So that really was his request, not to be hurt and to smoke a bowl of weed. We let him, we got both of those done, and eventually walked him out and got
Mhm.
him processed. And the subsequent jury found him guilty, and he was sentence for a long time, which was good. Israel Keys, our other serial killer, in
Hmm.
an interview, he requested a some type of specialty coffee, peanut butter Snickers bar.
Oh,
Actually, the
wow.
coffee was an Americano, and then a nice cigar. And that way he would give us information on the homicides that he committed. So it can be all over the spectrum. Serial killers usually want people to look at them and have praise for them on how well they did their killings. So they're very egocentric. So we play
Mm.
off that as investigators. We play up to their ego. As odd as it sounds, we compliment them on their homicides. We compliment them on
What?
getting away with it for so long from law enforcement. It leads them to talk about it. It leads them
Ah, okay.
yeah, we're not actually empathizing with him, and we're not
Right,
actually giving him compliments because it's heinous acts that they do. But that's the
right.
only way to engage them is to play off their ego, and then they give you the entire story.
And they get more relaxed with the conversation, it seems, huh?
Absolutely.
Okay. Wow. Wow. That's amazing. So in Alaska, uh, is there a death penalty or is it just there's no death penalty there?
We don't have a death penalty. I mean, we have life in prison,
Okay.
but no death penalty currently.
Okay. Okay. So do you feel like these odd requests before they give up, or is it because this is their last shot at freedom, so they want to enjoy the things they won't be able to enjoy inside?
So I think some of that, and then some of it's a little power play, right?
Mm,
Serial killers and a lot of criminals, they like the power. They like to have some sort of power over individuals, and that means police officers as well or investigators. So by them forcing us to give them things, they feel that little bit of power. It's not that they
mhm.
don't want them. I'm sure they want those items as well, but boy, with them, I think it's really that power where they're demanding things, they're requesting things, just to feel that last bit of power before it's taken away.
Jeez, wow. Okay. Amazing. Now, Doug, I know you also handled uh, deviant sexual crimes, correct?
I did, correct.
Can you talk a little bit about exactly what the definition of a sexual crime is and um, how you handled those cases as well?
Yeah, it can be all over the spectrum, meaning force sexually is obviously sexual assault or rape.
Mhm.
That's and most people know that definition. What I document mostly in the book are these paraphilias and fetishes that became criminal or criminal in nature or investigatory in nature that I worked on in my career. These are the real weird things that people do behind closed doors. And when I say people, these are coworkers, neighbors, your bosses, well-respected business individuals in our communities. It has the whole spectrum. So nobody was off limits to this deviant sexual uh, type of crime. What I found fascinating as law enforcement is it always shocked me to the extent people will go to fulfill their sexual urges. Like there's no stopping them when they're on that task. Other criminals like robbers, burglars, they would stop, they would ebb and flow, but sexual deviants, they don't stop. They just continue on their fetish, looking for victims, engaging these types of behavior. It always fascinated me as a cop, and the cases were very weird. And
Mhm.
in a sense, cops like to investigate those because it's not the norm. We see the norm every day. We investigate thousands of cases that are similar. I was always shocked at these cases, and that's why I think I had a little more interest. And I always went back to the human psyche of the individual. How could they commit such heinous acts, whether it's on animals, whether it's on people,
Oh my God.
whether it was on themselves? It always fascinated me, and that's why I created the book
Yeah.
to focus on those type of true crimes.
So these are not the smartest people, the smartest cookies in the bunch. Am I correct? That create these sexual crimes. It's a little bit different from the serial killers.
Yeah, I think that's for certainly some of them. I'd say that's true. Some of the autoerotic cases, those may be well-respected people in our community that probably have higher intelligence. Most of these investigations were accidents, not homicides in the autoerotic style. But bestiality, I would say, certainly goes down to a lower IQ.
Oh
Uh,
man.
necrophilia, and for your listeners, that's engaging in sex with dead corpses. I think that probably goes down to a lower IQ as well. but it could be all over the spectrum. It's hard to judge that specifically.
And you've had cases with necrophilia. I know that's in chapter 5 of your book, but um, have you had a personal case where it was just too much for you with that?
It's not too much. I'm one of the good things, one of the things I was good at in law enforcement is I can separate, meaning when I'm at work, I can really focus on work and I know the job has to be done, the investigation has to be done, no matter how horrific, because if it's not done properly, that individual gets released and then can commit the crime again. So I can separate that. And then when the clock, when I take that clock off and I'm off work, I can then transition into regular citizen and family member. I think the cops that do the best, kind of have that inert within themselves.
Hmm.
Uh, but Joshua Wade is one in my conversations with him. And, the medical examiner post uh, evaluation on these corpses engaged in necrophilia with his victims. So this is a serial killer that liked to have sex with his victims while they're alive, and he also liked to have sex with his victim post-mortem when they're dead. That's a
Okay.
unique mindset, right?
Hmm.
Israel Keys, the other serial killer, also mentioned to investigators that he liked to have sex with dead bodies. If you read up on serial killers like Ted Bundy, which is one of the
Hmm.
most famous, he would do it as well, the Green River Killer. So again, I think this gets back to power with those individuals. In their minds, there's no greater power than taking a life and then
Hmm.
dominating that body in their minds. As sick as it sounds, that's what they get off on.
My goodness, this is crazy. So, I mean, just to hear the way that individuals think and actually commit these crimes, has there been any? I know a lot of times the thought is, most of these crimes are committed by men. Have you come across a lot of these serial killers or sexual crimes that were committed by women at
Yeah,
all?
that's a great question too, and I do detail that in the book. Very unique. So I don't want to say that these type of crimes are only perpetrated by men, but the number far outreaches what's perpetrated by women. I think on necrophilia, I think it's 50 to 1 for men on
Mhm.
studies that have been done. I would say it's probably higher. I document one case in the book on female necrophilia, but it's
Mhm.
extremely rare. I don't have a reason as to why men commit, a vast proportion of these crimes, but they do. There's no doubt about it.
Wow, wow, amazing, amazing. So let's talk a little bit about your book. Um, I know that, of course, going through everything that you went through once you retired, it was like, you know what, hey, I can, put this into a book. How long did it take you writing this book? What was your thought process going into this book? And how did you come up with the name? Well, we kind of touched on that, but, at the end, how did you just say, hey, this is going to be the name of the book?
Yeah, working for a long career. Typically, cops, what we do is when we go to parties or we have events, family members or friends or non-law enforcement will ask you, "What's the craziest case you've ever been on?" Typically and invariably, those would always go to the sexual deviant cases. And it's not that robberies aren't great investigations, homicides, but people really wanted to know the weird stuff that happened in their town. And predominantly, women would engage even more in the deep, dark questions of these cases, which I always found fascinating at these, whether it was at dinners or parties. And invariably, they said, "You should write a book about these cases. They're fascinating." And I thought to myself, when I retire, I will write the book and I'll write it about these cases because there's no other book like that, reference true crime. Uh, I wrote the book in about 3 months
Oh,
when
wow.
when I retired. So it was but I had all the cases, the information, I worked them. So a fairly easy write because I lived these cases night and day.
Right, right.
And then I thought naively that I'll go get a publisher and they'll all clamor for this book and they'll want to publish it. So I met with about 6 publishers. These are the big publishers in the US. And they'd read the book and then they'd come back and say, "Boy, this is dark stuff. We don't know if we can print it. Let, let us think about it." And one by one, they would eventually decline the book. To the point after 6, I almost gave up because they simply didn't want to publish the book. They liked the material, they liked how it was written,
Hmm.
it was pretty extreme for him. So then I found a publisher that said, "We'll publish your book." and then we were off and running. That process took a couple years, editing, everything that goes into it. The title, you're right. The title plays off 50 Shades of Gray, but it really is similar in nature, except this is all 100% true and documented cases. So it talks about similar stuff like sadomasochism in the book, bestiality, all that. So it really gets into it, but these are all live cases. So it's kind of play off the 50 Shades of Gray, but it works well for the material inside it. But it was a tough, long process to get it published. I will say the book's doing extremely well. We've done 4 book signings at Barnes and
Oh
Nobles.
wow.
All the book signings have sold out, so it's
Oh,
very
that's
popular to
wonderful.
date.
Oh, wow, that is wonderful. That is great to hear, Doug. I'm really glad to hear that. And with that being your first book, you could not possibly fit 25 years into one book, right? So, any other books coming after this?
Yeah, I think that this it'll be up to the publisher. There may be another book similar to this one, but I do have a book in the works, and it's about serial killers in Alaska. Those cases I've worked. This will be more of a traditional true crime book, but it has some really unique audio with these individuals that has never been heard before. That I will also put in the book, and then an audio book and ebook as well. But really deep into these investigations with serial killers. It's a very popular subject. Alaska is quite unique. For some reason, we bring the worst of the worst that like to come to Alaska. Maybe because it's dark and cold and vast in landmass, and they think they can get away with it. But we have some really unique killers that come.
Mhm.
So that's certainly a book in the future that I'll write that'll be more traditional true crime.
What makes them, outside of it being cold and dark? Is there a lot of uninhabitable land there, like in Canada? Is that what brings killers there, do you think? Or what do you think drives them there to Alaska?
Well, Alaska is very independent. It's we call ourselves the land of the free, and kind of do what you want. Obviously, not harming anybody else. You have a lot of land mass, so certainly there's a lot of place to dispose of bodies. You're not like in a city where you have to put a body in a trash can or something like that. So I think that's part of it, and they think that perhaps we're some of them that transition there, like our serial killer Israel Keys. I
Hmm.
think he thought that we were somewhat unsophisticated in law enforcement, and he could get away with it longer. That's not the case. We're pretty up to speed as far as law enforcement in Alaska.
Hmm.
But I think that's part of it. They think that, again, they can dispose of bodies. It's a giant landmass. There's not a huge population, so people
Right.
won't see them. And perhaps that we don't have investigators that are good enough to catch them. In the end, they're always wrong, but that might be some of the lure of Alaska.
Wow. 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 Okay. Every time I think of a crime with Alaska, I think of that movie with Al Pacino. I think it was Robin Williams in it as well, Insomnia, where he couldn't sleep because of, you know, the way that you guys have daylight for what is it, 7 months of the year, I think, or am I
Yeah,
off there?
I remember that movie. That's old school. So Anchorage during summer solstice will get about 21 to 22 hours of light. If you go further north, Barrow, which is called Ukqiavik now, it's the northern tip of Alaska. Just picture that. So the sun sets there in November and it doesn't rise again until late January. So think of
Oh,
that. You have pure darkness. I wouldn't like that. Anchorage is, we have a lot of darkness, but you don't have that pure 24-hour darkness, which that would kind of get on you a little bit.
right. That would play a big part in your psyche, especially if you're working on a hard case or, just any day to day activity. I'm sure. Well,
Yep.
I'm glad you don't have to deal with that. So, real quick, I know that we've touched on, some the case there with the negotiations. Has there been a case that was a breeze, that was a good case for you? That it wasn't, it was a bad in nature, but it was an easier case for you to solve.
Yeah, one that was interesting, kind of comical. We typically negotiators, as the lead negotiator, I'll bring out a team, and a team consists of 4 individuals, so 4 law enforcement individuals. You'll have the main negotiator. That's the person that's going to contact the suspect or whoever is in crisis. You'll have a secondary negotiator. That person listens in on the earpiece or the phone, and then gives that main negotiator little notes or tidbits that they're missing or not picking up during that conversation. 4 sets of ears are always better than two. Our third negotiator, I'll task them as intel negotiator. What that means is they will They will go through everything about you, your job history, your criminal history, your social media, everything, your political stances. If you drink Coke over Pepsi, we want to know that. We want to know everything about you because that benefits the negotiator. And then you would have somebody like me, the team lead, who would be the liaison between the command staff and the SWAT team. Remember, the command staff will want to sometimes make entry, take that individual into custody. Negotiators have to hold them off and negotiate with our mouths and prevent any type of violence. So it's always that push-pull between us and command staff. That's how the team works. One
Mhm.
interesting case is we had an individual that had come up from Colombia, committed a few crimes in Alaska, all drug-related. We had surrounded the residents to, effect an arrest, get that individual out and arrest them on these drug charges. Well, while we were calling in, the phone wasn't answered. The individual would not answer it. We kept ringing the phone over and over again. And the negotiator would just hang up real quick and redial because we want somebody to answer.
Right.
While we were doing this, the individual from Colombia picked up and said hello. The negotiator inadvertently hung up the phone,
Oh,
just because he was in autoplay, right? Hang up,
right.
redial, because we've done this 100 times.
Right.
Well, the suspect thought, because in Colombia, police will, in the interview afterward, will fake call in, and then when you come out, they won't arrest you, they'll kill you. A
Oh,
lot of corruption in Colombia. So
right.
he immediately came out with his hands up. We didn't even talk with him, and he gave up. So the investigation never started. But when we asked him, why did you come out? He
Mhm.
thought when we hung up, we really didn't want to talk to him. Like his homeland, he thought he would be executed. So he gave up immediately. So that was a unique one where the negotiators, by pure luck, got the individual out. But it was because some of his prior history in a different country, his distrust of law enforcement, that he thought that we perhaps weren't trustworthy. So kind of comical, but in the end, he came out. He was safe. We arrested him on the drug charges, and the
Mhm.
rest was history.
Okay. Any hostage situation end in deaths for you guys?
In my career, yes, it's extremely rare. I'll go back to where I mentioned that negotiators are almost always truthful. And
Mhm.
by that, I mean, when I negotiated with Joshua Wade, he said, am I going to go to jail? Am I going to go to prison for life? What citizens might think is you should say, no, it's up to the judge, it's up to a jury. They
Mhm.
don't want to hear that. What they want to hear is the truth. So,
Mhm.
what I told Joshua Wade is, well, I can't say exactly what will happen. You're going to have to answer for your crimes. They respect that because it's an honest answer from the negotiator. If I said, no, you're not, we'll make a deal, you're not going to prison, he knows I'm lying and it won't work. So I always teach new negotiators, be honest always. We had one unique case where we had a barricaded subject that had already executed an individual and had hostages. He was not going to come out. He wanted the police to remove themselves and take themselves back. The only option there was to get that individual near a window so our SWAT team could take him out and prevent other deaths from occurring inside that residence. That's an extremely rare occasion. And what wouldn't have worked is said, hey, come closer to the window because we're going to take a shot at you. What does work is come close to the window and see that police have been moving back,
Mhm.
and then we have to take excessive force at that point to save others' lives. That's the only case in my history that I can even account. Most of them are solved and people come out. Now, I will say some of the individuals we negotiated took their own lives during
Oh,
the
wow.
negotiation. So that does happen more frequent than us committing, uh, you know, the act of taking somebody out.
Mhm.
Typically, it's suicide on their ends, especially in some of the most extreme. But a vast majority, and I'm going to put it at 90%, were able to effectively come out safely. Nobody gets hurt, and they answer for their charges.
Any hostages lost?
Never in my career, in the Anchorage Police Department's career, yes, there have been, but never in a live negotiation with myself or my team.
Okay. Okay. And excuse me. So when you say that some of them have ended up in suicides, right? Is that something you've it's been with your team that you've had some of that happen before?
Absolutely. And we do our best as negotiators to work with that person. I will tell you sometimes when an individual decides suicide's the only option, it's very difficult to come back, especially if they've committed these crimes and they're looking at multiple life sentences in prison.
Right.
Uh, they're going to take that way out, and it's often not the fault of the negotiator or the team. It's probably an impossible situation. We feel each and every one of those. Even though they're a killer, we want them out safely. We want them to answer for their crimes. We don't want them to kill themselves.
So when that happens, is that a heavy load for you to carry around with, Doug? Like when that has happened to you and your team?
I think it is for some. Again, I can separate those emotions, meaning if you've heinously killed somebody and you take your life, I
Mhm.
don't want you to take your life, but I also don't hold stress, and I don't constantly think about that because uh, it wasn't me that did it. It was you.
Mhm. Mhm.
You paid with your own life, whether it's suicide or some other form. So I was always good with that, but I did have team members that it weighed on heavily. So we would support each other post incident. We would talk things through, and we would always check up on individuals because everybody handles it differently, and
Mhm.
that's perfectly okay. And we'd make sure that they were all right. But it takes a unique cop to be a hostage negotiator. It's not a mentally, it's a taxing job. It's not easy, and not everybody can do it.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So there's, I guess the question then goes to there hasn't, because when I asked about the suicide question, are any hostages lost? And it made sense with your response about the suicide. I was trying to see here what would be considered an unsuccessful negotiation. And I guess it's when you have to pull the trigger, right?
Yeah, I'm even going to categorize the suicides as an unsuccessful negotiation. So
Mm,
any negotiation where the individual isn't brought out safely and nobody else is harmed, including the individual, uh, that's a successful one. If it anything other than that, I categorize as unsuccessful. And it may not be that the negotiators didn't do their job properly or their additional law enforcement. It just turned out the way it turned out, and it's unsuccessful. But a win for our team was always that individual, no matter the crime, came out, was put in handcuffs, and paid for their crimes.
wow. Wow. Amazing. Okay. I appreciate that. I really do appreciate it. Try not to take up too much of your time, but man, this is really interesting and
Yeah,
to
it's all good.
understand and dive into this. One thing I did want to ask you, and again, I'm trying not to take up too much of your time here, Doug, but I appreciate it. In your book, you talked about, and I want to make sure I'm saying this correctly, DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it wasn't like a list of things, right? Excuse me.
Yep. Yeah, that's we call it the psychiatry Bible. It
Okay.
has everything from A to Z on anything that deals with mental illness, with
Mhm.
paraphilias, all of that. Why that's important for cops is because we're not only the gatekeepers for the criminal justice system, we're also the gatekeepers for the mental health institutions, meaning that a lot of our calls that we go to are people in mental crisis. It makes sense if if you watch videos on TV, uh, you see that everywhere. So it's important for law enforcement to be trained up in these specific areas dealing with mental illness. That's we call that our Bible. We learn that. Negotiators certainly learn that because we're going to use those things in our interactions and negotiations. So police officers can be very sophisticated in their background, in their knowledge, even in the medical profession. It seems odd that we would be, but it's by necessity because we deal with mental illness constantly in society.
Wow. Wow. Okay. And so there's a lot of failures, right? And acts of sexual crimes or crazy crimes like that. And like you said in your book and everything you've come across, you name it, you've come across it. Has there been something that's been just too disgusting for you?
Well, I think there's a story in there called Bob the Builder, and that was a carpenter, and he was incredible.
Mhm.
If you saw his house, I mean, absolutely beautiful, detailed. He could do anything. He had a fetish that where was an anal fetish where he'd take larger and larger objects into him, which sounds to normal people in regular society quite odd. It's not as rare as you might think.
Mhm.
Eventually, he had he set up this system where he could do it. The system failed and he ended up dying from that. That was a hard one to take. His
Wow.
wife found him. Uh, that's an image that a spouse is never going to get out of their mind forever. That's a unique case for law enforcement. I've never seen that before. So things like that are shocking. Again, that's a sexual fetish paraphilia that he practiced, ultimately cost him his life. But in regular society, this is the everyday USA guy, 2 kids, wife, beautiful house,
Wow.
great business career. You just never know what people are doing behind closed doors. And after 25 years, I'm rarely surprised. But this one, which I call Bob the Builder in my book, it was
Hmm.
surprising.
Wow. Wow. Amazing. Well, Doug, man, I tell you, you have a million stories to tell with over 25 years of experience. And I really appreciate you taking the time to sit here with me and have this conversation. Before I let you go, I do have one last question. For some of our audience members that may be listening to this and they're hearing about these different crimes and the people that are committing these crimes, what advice would you have for these people, how to better prepare themselves, protect themselves while out? And the reason why I ask that, not just because it's a good question to ask, but literally 40 minutes before you and I sat down here to have this conversation, there was something that came across my timeline where in broad daylight, 4:30 in the afternoon, literally a quarter of a mile from where my office is, there was an attempted abduction at a Walmart, 4:30 in the afternoon on Monday of this week. And I'm just like, how does that happen? 4:30. I mean, literally walked up to this young lady and tried to throw her in the trunk. Thankfully, there was someone else there that stopped everything from happening and he ran, but he later got caught. He took her purse. It was crazy to me because 4:30 in the afternoon, you think of things like that happening really early in the morning where it's close to dark or late at night. And so as an expert on dealing with these crimes, sexual crimes or things like that, people being held hostage, what is advice that you can give to people how to protect themselves and better be prepared? I mean, I know that's a crazy way to say that, but prepare themselves better to deal with something like that happening to them, or a sexual crime, or anything, abduction.
I appreciate the question. I think that uh, I can answer this similar to how I raised my own children. And, I have 2 daughters. I gave them the same advice, and my sons. But what I find in interviewing victims that survive post incident is that always follow your gut. So the majority of victims always had a sense, a feeling that something was off, whether they went into a parking garage late at night, whether they thought somebody was following them, but they didn't think that they were, so they didn't. They went into a private space instead of a public space. Somebody was following them in a car. They thought it was weird, but they continued to drive into a parking garage and not to a police department or someplace safe. They always had a gut feeling. So the first line of defense is follow your gut. If it feels odd, trust it and get yourself somewhere safe, right? The
Mhm.
second, there will be cases similar to the abduction attempt that you talked about that can happen 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Victims must fight. Uh, I know they don't want to. I know the perpetrator may say, I will shoot you, I'll
Mhm.
stab you. My advice, and I give this to my own kids, is that if they're going to kill you there, they're certainly going to kill you wherever you're abducted. And there's going to
Mhm.
be a lot of bad things that happen in the interim. It's very rare in my experience that perpetrators kill right on the spot. The
Mhm.
reason being is it attracts attention, it attracts law enforcement, it attracts citizens. They want to escape. So typically they give up and run.
Mhm.
The crimes where individuals didn't make it is they complied with those demands and went to various locations and were murdered. So fight always to the death. Follow your instinct, and then keep yourself in safe situations. If you're single female, you probably don't want to be walking down dark alleys at 2 in the morning. You can ask somebody to walk you to your car. You can park someplace that's public. Don't put yourself in scenarios where it's dangerous. I see this a lot with people, and it's not that they're doing it on purpose. They just don't think about the crimes that can happen. What I I know from personal experience is there's real evil in the world, and I hope most citizens never experience that. I've experienced a lot of it, so I'm always on guard with that, and I know people aren't. But remember, there's individuals out there that wish to do harm upon you. So the best thing and what you have to do is protect yourself. Law enforcement can help, but they can't be there 24/7.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Really appreciate it. Yeah, the young lady that got attacked, he stated that he had a knife on him, and you know, thankfully, citizens saw that, and he, like you said, he ran off. You
Yep.
know, so I really appreciate it, Doug. I want to take the time out just to thank you so much for all the valued information you provided today. This conversation that you had with me, it was really, really my pleasure with you having you on. I would encourage all of our listeners, please, please, if you have a moment, check out Doug on his website. It's called DougFifer.com, and it's spelled DougFifer.com. You also can go on Amazon as well to find his book, 50 Shades of True Crime. It is by Douglas Fifer, Sex, Drugs, and Killer Kink. Now, Doug, is it available anywhere else that listeners can find this book outside of Amazon?
Yeah, it is. It's pretty much everywhere. On the website, if you go to dougpfeiffer.com, you can watch the book trailer. It shows you the city of Anchorage. It's kind of a cool book trailer, so I highly recommend listeners to do that. Barnes and Nobles, in stores, online. It'll be available. It's on ebook, Kindle currently. The audiobook will come out early October, so within
Oh
a few
man,
weeks.
yes.
Audiobook's pretty unique. The reader of it loves this project because it's such a unique book. He's got a great voice for it. So I'm looking forward to that audiobook coming out. But if you Google 50 Shades of True Crime, you can pretty much find it anywhere.
Oh man, I was looking forward to hearing your voice on that.
Uh, I'll
You
just,
got a
I'll,
great voice for
yeah,
it.
I'll tell you, my wife, she had my voice cut, and then she had this professional's voice cut, and I was
Mhm.
quickly eliminated, and he was selected. Uh, I'm going to defer to my wife. I think
Absolutely.
so. He's got a pretty good voice, and I think the listeners will enjoy it.
Wonderful, wonderful. That's great to hear. And big ups to your wife. She's a saint, having to deal with that, with the anxiety of you going out on that job, because that's a very taxing, stressful position, not only for yourself, but also for your wife and your daughters as well, with you going out. So, you know, great job for your wife as well.
Appreciate it.
Um, Thank you again, Doug. I really, really appreciate it. I can't wait for your next books to come out because I definitely would love to have you back with us. Thank you so
Yeah, I think I'm
much.
losing you a little bit, Ronnie.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yeah, I got you now.
Okay. Sorry about that. That's
Yeah.
okay. I just said I want to thank you so much. I can't wait till your next books come out. So would love to have you back on to talk about those as well.
I'd love to come back on, and I hope your listeners enjoy this podcast. And also, if they read the book again, I think it's going to be quite unique and interesting for them.
Absolutely. Thank you so much again, Doug. This has been Conversations with Ronnie Keith.